Welcome to Textural Anthologies, the podcast series that explores the personal and professional side of creative individuals. My name is Massimo Casagrande, and in this first series, I will be focusing on the slash culture. Today's creative boundaries are blurred more than ever, and with this series, we will explore how the creative industry and creative people are influenced and inspired by other disciplines. Over the next few episodes, I will be having informal conversations with friends, colleagues, and fellow slashers to discover more about their stories, their journey, what makes them tick, and above all, their creative outlets. Enjoy the episode. For today's guest, we travel back to East London, and to be honest, is someone I've never met before. I stumbled across his work on Instagram and was immediately captivated by it, so much so that I reached out to him, inviting him as a guest. He is a fine artist who defines himself an illusionist, where through his paintings, sculptures and drawings, he investigates the neurological impairment and the fragility of human memory and the desire to acknowledge and record those he has and has not met. Today, I had the chance to meet up with him and discover more about his work, his creative process, and how much his grandfather has had a huge impact on his path and on his career. I'm happy to welcome today's guest, the fine artist, Dene Leigh. Hi, Dean. Thank you for joining us. So glad you could be a guest in my podcast this week. And thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me, Massimo. It's a pleasure to be here.
The podcast is, I interview people that I know personally, that I've worked with. I actually stumbled across your Instagram account and I was immediately drawn to your paintings and what you do. So, I reached out because I just thought it was really interesting and I wanted to discover more about you and what you do. So I'm glad you said yes. Like this random bloke just kind of like texting you on Instagram, to be part of something. But I'm glad you said yes. And I always start off by asking my guests what they wanted to be as a kid. So when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I was always interested in creativity, but there were a couple of routes when I was very young that I wanted to go down. One was an artist, but before that was an architect and a magician. So there's a few things there. And I did actually perform quite a lot when I was younger with magic.
As a magician?
I did, yes. I didn't go so far with the architecture, but I was very much interested in the concept of that as well. Oh, and actually an archaeologist I wanted to be when I was very young in primary school.
Oh, me too. But that was Indiana Jones's fault because I used to work the whole time. So I was always like, that's what I want to be.
I don't blame you.
Your work addresses themes of memory. And I know this is it's something personal that happened to you with your grandfather passing away from Alzheimer, and he had a stroke as well, and it affected his memory. And through your work, that it was something that you wanted to explore memory through your paintings. How do you transmit this? Like, how do you take this memory concept and transmit it through your paintings?
So I have very fond memories of my grandfather. He was almost like a father figure to me, and so that's why this holds such this subject of my grandfather and his life and the memories based around that have such a potent influence on my work. So my grandfather had a stroke when I was just when I started Wimbledon School of Art for my degree. So it was a big shock being accepted for Wimbledon and then moving on to the degree and witnessing my grandfather one day, who was very, very independent, 89 years old, was looking after me, driving around in London, taking me places, being very much like a great grandparent. And throughout his life, he sort of helped me a lot and guided me, was a very important person to me. And so when we got the call one day that he had sort of been found on the floor in his bungalow, and myself and my mum and the rest of our family went to see, it was a huge shock seeing what happened, because he didn't know who I was, the way he looked at me, etc. His speech, his language was all completely diminished. And when he ended up in hospital after this, and we knew what it was, the stroke, and we realized there wasn't going to be any kind of recovery essentially as a 89-year-old man, there wasn't going to be any recovery. I started to use the experiences that he was going through, that I imagined he was going through in my work. And life was normal for him one day, and then an unknown world the next. And so I tried to sort of transmit these emotions and see through his eyes in my work. And one of the first things that I begun to use as a medium was collage to explore this. So I had lots of found materials, actually, some from his home, some from my great uncle's home, who was a collector. He collected a lot of things, lots of rubbish that I was interested in as well. Lots of old decayed pieces of paper and stuff of that nature. So aesthetically, I was very much interested in it. But I was looking at my grandfather's main impairments, which were his inability to recognize familiar faces, such as my own formerly familiar faces.
And that I can imagine, like you said, from one day to the next, this, he was so involved with your life, and then sort of having to explain who you were, I think for him, it's such an awful thing to go through.
Exactly. And like you say, to know me one minute and not the next, and for me to explain who I am is very upsetting, particularly when we look at the next thing, which was his inability to understand language. So he couldn't communicate, he couldn't read. Aphasia is a technical term, the neurological term. So he had aphasia, which meant no matter how we aim to describe what he was going through, his condition, he wouldn't understand. And so that's very, very powerful, very emotional. And the third condition was his inability to perceive objects. So he wouldn't understand the function of an object, of a paintbrush, of course, for example, a toothbrush, a cup. They were just, what I would imagine they would just be like abstract objects to him. He wouldn't understand their function.
So is that maybe what inspired you with your sculptures? Because I know you sort of take these random objects and create shapes and silhouettes.
Exactly. Well, I've been to make sculptures through objects that I found on the streets in London, alongside old tips, and also on a personal level in my granddad's home that I mentioned. So old pieces of paper, old family photographs. There was a notebook that he had that he would tell me about when he was younger, which was from when he was prisoner of war as a British. Yeah, so he was a British soldier, and he was prisoner of war in a few places, actually, in Italy and in Germany. I think he was in Japan. And this notebook was from a prison camp in Germany.
Oh, it must be so interesting to read those stories. Like, what is
so interesting. And what was inside it was a poem of each of the prisoners inside the camp. So the 40 or so prisoners that were inside, there was their surname, their number from 1 to 45 or so, and a witty poem about each person.
Wow.
And within that was actually a couple of sketches. One was of the prison camp with the barbed wire. I always remember my grandfather said the barbed wire and how sort of dangerous it was, the spikes. And I started to incorporate those elements in my painting. In my newest one behind me, I was looking at this repetition of that prison camp with the barbed wire, which I've used a couple of times in my painting. So you have this correlation with memory and such. And of course, the old notebook has so many marks and wear and tear and yellowed pages to it that actually realistically have influenced my whole entire practice, and certainly from the beginning with this element of decay.
Well, your paintings reflect that notebook. I can see the one behind you right now, but also, the ones that you've posted on your Instagram account, it is sort of these pages which have been worn and torn, some ripped photographs. And as you mentioned, the prison camps, I see that quite a lot. You always have the reference of sort of the tower with the barbed wire. I see that. What would be amazing is, because you said that they're the names of the other prisoners, if there's some way of getting in touch with the family, because it would be, even for them to sort of have this historical document that somebody knew their grandfather or great-grandfather and, wrote poems about them. And that's...
I mean, yeah, it's super interesting, super... it's a museum piece almost. It's just beautiful.
Absolutely. So how, like, your process? So when you start a painting, what do you sit there and go through your grandfather's notebook, or is there maybe a particular memory that comes to mind? How do you start one of your paintings?
So since my granddad had a stroke, and then he lived with those conditions for about 3 or 4 years and passed away, my work has taken a slightly different development. It still incorporates those conditions that I mentioned with memory, with faces, object, perception, and language, but it's looking more at this sense of decay and wear and tear as human beings. Because when my grandfather passed away, actually, soon after, about a year after, my mum unexpectedly passed away.
Oh, wow.
And so there's these horrible, deep elements within my practice that exist, where I'm sort of, in a sense, aware of the body, the human body, and it being our vehicle which drives us around, but also it's something that's not permanent. But I'm trying to add this element of decay and referencing our own mortality in our work. So there's been developments of this idea of facial recognition in my work, the inability to recognize familiar faces, which I initially obscured faces, recognizable faces, or family faces, or people who I don't know. And now I've eventually included those faces or invented faces without obscuring them, but muting the tones and the details. So in a sense, they appear kind of ghost-like, but they still, in a sense, have this solid presence as a body. It's just their faces have been worn away. So I'm looking at these elements. And of course, memory is paramount amongst all of that.
Two things come to mind. So it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen those photographs of prisoners of war from World War I, and they had sort of these reconstructive surgery on their faces. And it kind of really, I don't know, what you were just describing made me think of those, because it is, you can see the shape of the head, but the whole face is completely sort of morphed, isn't it? From the bombs or whatever they've done. And then again, the fragility of human memory. I don't know what your thoughts are, but like with social media nowadays, we become so addicted to all these things, to phones and technology, that are we still relying a lot on memory? I mean, as a kid, I used to know phone numbers off by heart. Like now, if I lose my phone, that's it. I've got no contact. I don't know, and we're so addicted on this. And also the faces with these selfies and all the different filters we put on. Is that sort of, are we trying to create memories? What are your thoughts on social media?
I think social media is amazing, and I think Instagram has changed the game for a lot of artists as well, because people within the art world who artists previously couldn't have shown their work to can now do so. So there's this amazing concept of serendipity as well.
The exposure.
Yeah, incredible exposure. The internet has changed the game. I'm sure people will say that it has its negative aspects, and of course it does, but I think as an artist, it's a very powerful thing. Instagram is completely visual, and this visual sense is very important to my work and to a lot of other artists' work.
I know you had 2 solo exhibitions here in the States.
Mm-hmm.
One was in LA, and one was, where was the other one? I can't remember. Was it just LA? Were they both in LA, or did you?
Yeah, so they're both in LA. I'm represented by a gallery called Bart Gallery in Los Angeles, BAERT, and they've represented me for about 4 or so years, and we've had 2 solo exhibitions together and a group show. So it's kind of nice seeing the dynamics between the 2 different arts cultures in London and in Los Angeles as well.
Is there a big difference? Do you find it a huge difference?
Everything's a lot more spaced out in Los Angeles, and everything at all, and of course the galleries are as well. So you really need to jump in a car to get around, whereas in London it's a lot more accessible, should we say.
And I guess they want bigger artworks to fill the walls because they're so huge.
Potentially, yeah.
Have you considered coming to Art Basel in Miami?
It would be nice. It would be nice to see a lot more a lot more art fairs nowadays, because we can't really see much except through the online viewing rooms at the moment. But Art Basel Miami would be great. And I've never been. Obviously, I'm very familiar with Frieze, so it'd be interesting to see the kind of differences between what's being shown in all of these different fairs. But Frieze is a favorite of mine for sure.
Frieze is awesome. I'm a big fan of Frieze Masters.
Yeah, same.
It's so nice. It's absolutely, and I love. There was this one gallery, I can't remember what it was called, but every year they had these most amazing installations. One year they recreated sort of the apartment of a curator. Then the next one they did this asylum with oh my God, not Duchamp. It was another artist, but it was amazing. And it was just.
Was it Basquiat?
No, it was another. It started with the D.
Jean de Buffet.
Yes, it was Dubuffet. And they created this amazing asylum with like all these sort of like scratches on the wall, and they had his paintings on there. It was just so nice.
I remember seeing it, actually. It was incredible. I got a couple of images of it. One with, there was for some reason a dog in freeze, and it was sort of lurking inside their booth.
Oh, really?
And I actually got a picture, uploaded it onto my Instagram, of course, and our Instagram's as well.
I used to love that. Oh, Freeze Masters was absolutely my favorite. You know, it was really nice, really curated pieces.
The juxtaposition of all these different masterpieces with more recent.
And I guess this year it's been cancelled.
Yeah, exactly. It would be happening probably in the next October usually.
October, yeah.
Very soon. So it's a shame, and I don't think that online viewing rooms can.
Is that what they're doing? Online viewing rooms?
I would imagine, yeah, it's an online viewing room. Yeah.
We've Art Basel's been cancelled here as well, so it's gonna be a strange December. But I do know that some galleries have actually insisted. They said even though Art Basel is cancelled, they're still going ahead and putting on shows. Obviously, social distancing and everything, but they feel that it isn't right to sort of completely cancel Art Week, so they are going ahead with some stuff, which is good. I really like that. It's quite nice.
Yeah, there have been a few art fairs, lesser known art fairs, I think, that have been going on recently. So I saw on Instagram anyway.
I know that you mentioned collages earlier, and that is, I think in an interview you once said that you were looking at old masters, and that's also inspired the technique of collages. Is that correct or not?
I think the immediacy of collage was what initially attracted the medium to me, but I think maybe I was sort of, when I was doing it, I was sort of not particularly aware of the old masters in a sense. I was just doing it for the sake of creating collage and using found materials that are readily available. So the immediacy. I mean, of course, like artists like Picasso and what have you were important figures within collage, and Joseph Cornell with the assemblage and all of these kind of artists. And of course, the trompe-l'oeil painters, the Dutch trompe-l'oeil painters who kind of created works that appeared as though they were collage, but they were illusionistic paintings. These things have started to tie more into my work in recent years. But originally, it was more for the immediacy and love of just creating.
So when you were in college, were there any particular artists that you aspired to and sort of like, that's who I want to be, or were you just completely open to anything?
I think, so my high school was a very, in terms of our art department, we were taught by a very interesting tutor who paid a lot of respect to the old masters and the techniques that they would use. And so I came from that sort of background. And when I moved to Chelsea for my foundation, that was sort of like wiped out of me, and I got a bit of a shock because the technique wasn't so important. And that sort of kick up the backside was actually quite beneficial to me because it forced me to develop and to experiment and to explore things that I wouldn't usually. And actually the first thing that I did explore was collage. It was collage mixed with painting. So that was very interesting. I was always interested in the very technical painters like Rembrandt, Caravaggio, Salvador Dali, Magritte in more modern times when I was in high school. And then, as I said, that was sort of washed out of me when I went to Chelsea, and maybe resurfaced when I moved to Wimbledon for my BA. Why not?
And then it became a more Basquiat and sort of Pistoletto, like the
exactly,
which is great. Pistoletto is one of my favorites. I absolutely love that. And I love those stories, like Basquiat or even Gary Hume. They couldn't afford canvases, so they just started painting on doors, which is...
exactly.
I think the artists are the original upcyclers, recyclers, and sustainability people, because they just go ahead and work with what you've got. Has the pandemic or like the lockdown or whatever we're going through at the moment, has that somehow influenced the way you think, or like how you may be approaching some works? How is an artist's mind affected during lockdown?
It's really interesting because, of course, collecting materials and finding stuff and going to antiques fairs and markets, flea markets, is an important part of my practice in order to find these materials that maybe I don't know anything about. Sometimes they can be ambiguous as objects, and I can translate and combine them into something else. But of course, those markets weren't available to me during lockdown and the pandemic. And so that forces you to do things that you wouldn't usually do in your practice. And so the painting that I've just finished is predominantly, although it appears quite hyper-realistic in a sense, The source materials that I've used for it are pretty limited, and a lot of it has been fabricated and created by my memories and a couple of existing things that I've had or that I've manipulated. So the pandemic's forced me to experiment in such a way on the canvas and to create, the painting behind me, my newest one. There's a family portrait, and a lot of that composition has been painted in such a way where I'm sort of referring to images on Google in order to create the tartan dresses, and then the faces have been completely made up, and so I'm sort of trying to invent this personality through my memory. And the faces were the last thing that I actually added to the painting, which is interesting because I was trying to sort of get a feel how everything works and who these people could be, who they are, through my own imagination. And so the faces came last, and the features were very prominent to begin with, and then I started to mute down the color tones and the light until this started to fade.
And the faces in your other works, are they ever related to family members, or are they always sort of these fictitious people?
So generally they are fictitious, but actually the painting behind me, there's an image of my grandmother, which I remember from when I was younger, of course, at my grandparents' house. And that's my grandma sitting down on this chair when she was like a young child. And there's this piece of sellotape that's been wrapped around it to sort of hold this fragile photograph together. And so, yeah, there's these personal elements in the painting alongside fictitious elements, and then alongside certain parts that do exist. And so I'm trying to forge this correlation between things that exist, things that don't exist, and maybe things that have existed and I've seen in my mind that I've translated onto the canvas purely through my memories. So there's this really interesting juxtaposition between those elements.
Really nice. And what is this painting called?
So it's called Stranger Than Fiction. I only titled it a couple of days ago, and it's based on the title and a poem inside that book that I mentioned before, the Notebook.
Oh, okay.
Which was next to the prisoner of war camp in the drawing. So
nice.
Yeah.
When you graduate, how easy or difficult is it for an art student to sort of get noticed by a gallery? Like, I know what a fashion student has to do, but like an art student, what do they do? Is there sort of a graduate art week for students, or do you sort of approach galleries? Do you send pictures of your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a tricky question to answer, because I don't think there's any right or wrong way of doing it. And I feel there's an issue with art school, which is they don't teach you what to do when you graduate. Certainly, to my knowledge, they don't anyway. Art school is very good at teaching you to be a creative and to push your work and to push the boundaries in those work. But of course, if you're not making the most of the opportunities when you're in art school after that degree show, or if your work isn't being seen by the right people who enjoy your work, because it's very subjective, then you're going to find it very challenging when you graduate. And so I don't think there's any fixed way of doing things. I think it's more about putting yourself out there, or going to private views, going to exhibitions, working in galleries rather than any other career at the beginning.
And like you said, now with Instagram, sort of approaching through social media and exposing your work to galleries through those platforms.
Yeah, because I think you're not being pushy by posting your work online. You're simply doing it. If someone follows you, then ultimately they probably want to see your work. Whereas if you're messaging a load of people and unsolicited emails and stuff, it might not really get the desired effect. It might be a bit annoying to the other person as well.
True. Do you think there's still a scene that exists today, or a tribe? Like, okay, the YBAs,
mm-hmm.
It's all famous when you read about them or learn about them at school. It just seems so simple. Like these art kids who decided just to put their work together, showcase it, and then voila, Saatchi comes along and buys it. I mean, it sounds so easy and so simple, but
yeah.
It's not. I mean, we all know they took forever, and there's a beautiful book. I don't know if you've read it, called Lucky Kunst by Gregor. And he talks all about how they started. And there's this one chapter which he describes a bus ride from Regent Street to Bethnal Green. And the way he describes East London just looks like a war camp. It's like, it feels so weird, especially since I was living here. It's like, oh my God. But do you think there is now sort of a community of, as in the sense of the YBAs, is there sort of this fraternity where maybe you can get together? Could there be a new YBA movement?
That's a really interesting question. What a what a question. They're not.
I mean, they're no longer Y, are they?
Tracy Emin's a great one from the YBAs. I love her work. But yeah, it's true. They're no longer young British artists there. But I don't know if there could be a new wave of something similar to the YBAs. You know, for example, where someone puts on a show and it's seen by, you know, Jay Joplin or whatever. I don't know if it's so simple as that, but
it's also different times. Like the sensationalism of what they presented in the 90s maybe isn't as relevant now. You know, it won't cause as much sensation now as it did then. So it's trying to see what is the new sensationalism that the new generation of artists can bring. It's tough.
I think what the YBAs did, which was interesting, which was, you know, just to find their own space somewhere and put on an exhibition. And I think Tracy Emin and another fellow YBA sort of had some kind of corner shop and had their working inside there. So her and Sarah Lucas. And so, I don't know, maybe it's being left to your own devices rather than making use of
absolutely
of the commercial gallery or making use of trying to be represented and going with these traditional notions. Maybe it's sort of trying to do it yourself to get it seen.
Absolutely. I think that is the way forward nowadays, because I think we sort of ambushed with so much image and so much stuff that I think, you know, it's nice when you got people going against the current and sort of doing something completely different. You get noticed a bit more. I think that's much nicer. So you've just finished one painting.
Mm-hmm.
What is next? Do you sort of take a break between your next one, or what is your ritual once you finish a painting?
Sometimes it's a long break and relaxing and getting some more exercise in or whatever, and just trying to recuperate after some long days, because I can have some long painting days, like early in the morning till early the next morning, like from 9 a.m. to like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. and I can do that quite comfortably. But so sometimes that can take its toll and you need to have a bit of a rest or just take a break. But I think because I've been working on this painting for so long, I think it's been about 4 months or so.
Wow.
Yeah, my longest painting in probably forever. So I think that's why there's so much detail in it. But I feel that my next piece is going to have a similar sense of detail to it and a lot more going on within the composition. And so that's going to take some playing around with some collages just to see maybe what would work as a composition and to just see what could potentially work. And I'm already like messing around with some existing materials. I made use of a flea market the other week in Liverpool Street.
Oh, take advantage.
So yeah, I'm working on a couple of things for that. Meanwhile, a couple of drawings, and that can just sort of keep you in the swing of things and in the creative spirit, which is important. But my next piece, I think, will have a similar sort of intensity to this one with different pictorial elements. But I like the development of this piece. If I'm to compare it to like my past pieces, there's so much going on within the composition, so much detail, so much that could be said about these elements of memory within the composition that I think I would be a fool if I didn't continue that sort of intensity in the next piece.
So if you align all your pieces together, do you see an evolution in maybe what you've done and how you've progressed with your paintings? Like you're saying now, composition, are you finding that you're becoming a bit more complex with your compositions and layout compared to before? Or are you finding that you're experimenting more with certain techniques?
I think it's now definitely it's an element of making the compositions a lot more complicated. My painting just before this was a complicated composition, and I thought it was complicated at the time, but now when I compare the two together, I'm like, whoa, this has gone to a completely different level in terms of the complexities that are going on and the dynamics between one image and another. And yeah, so that I think this is a huge turning point in my practice so far, in terms of what I've just created on the canvas, and something that I'm gonna be pursuing and developing a lot more.
Great. And a random question. So what's your guilty pleasure? What do you do to sort of unwind?
So I've started running quite a lot. actually. And it's kind of meditative.
That's a healthy guilty pleasure.
Yeah, I think my guilty pleasures are just healthier. I've started meditating as well, which is, again, a healthy guilty pleasure. But a proper guilty pleasure that you're referring to, I love chocolate. And who doesn't? A cocktail is nice as well, you know, to unwind. I like, you know, when it's possible to go out and unwind and relax with a couple of friends and have a nice drink. I think that can really help to relax. And
that's the best. That's the best guilty pleasure. Right, Dean. Well, I'm going to leave you to your Mars bar and a nice cocktail. And
it probably a Yorkie bar maybe, or a dark chocolate.
A Yorkie bar. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and speak soon.
Yeah, Massimo, thank you so much for inviting me. It was lovely speaking with you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I look forward to inviting you next week to our next episode. So stay tuned, stay safe, and speak soon. Bye.